Good morning, everyone. We're live from Lindsborg, and I'm going to make this introduction really short today because what we're going to film today is going to take a little bit longer than typical, but I think it's an important story to tell. Every year, the first weekend of May, the old Smoky Valley Roller Mills fires up and actually runs for Millfest. And Millfest is a great celebration of just prairie life and the early days of Lindsborg. And so you would be able to learn all kinds of things about rope making and broom making and lace making and just interesting things. But the pinnacle of what you learn is the Smoky Valley Roller Mill and getting to tour it while it's running. So I'm going to take you inside today, and Karmon Almquist, who is a wonderful volunteer in our community, is going to give us a superb tour of this place. You're going to learn a lot. I know I'm going to learn some things because I learn something new every time I come here for a tour. I typically do this with groups of, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people when we have bus tours. But typically, if you come on your own, it's a self-guided tour. So what you get today is top-notch special. So come with me inside, and we're going to have a tour today, and I hope you learn as much as I do about this great place. Good morning, Karmon.
Good morning to the Smoky Valley Roller Mill. Come in and we'll take a tour.
We're excited to be here today. You're one of the best tour guides, and this is going to be great. I always tell tour groups when I come here that I love the smell of this place. And people can't smell it, of course, on video, but it smells to me like my grandpa's farm shop. Can you tell us why?
Well, there's lots and lots of old wood in here that has been refurnished or refurbished several years ago. So, yes, it does have the smell of something a little older, I guess, is right. It's not a bad smell. It's just like a farm smell or a barn smell to me.
Yeah, it smells. I love the smell of it. It reminds me of my childhood.
Yeah.
So can you just start telling us about the mill? Because this is a great asset to our community.
Sure. Well, I could give you a little history quickly. This is actually the third mill that was built on this site. It was built in 1898 after the second mill burned down. It operated from 1898 through 1955, nearly continuously. There was a couple of years during the 30s Depression that they didn't operate, but it operated almost all of the time. There's so many interesting things that we don't have time to talk about, but we'll try hit the highlights here in a little bit.
That sounds really good. So where's the first place we're going to go?
Well, we'll go first into the office where the bookkeeper was and the person who weighed the grain before it was brought in and weighed it out of their trucks.
Okay, let's go.
Well, this is the office where the bookkeeper probably was behind where you're taking the pictures. But also on this side is a large scale or a scale measuring device. When the farmers would bring in their trucks or their trailers, they would drive them out across the scale directly outside. Then they would, of course, weigh that to determine how much grain or the gross weight. They would go unload and come back here and measure their truck again to determine how much grain was actually in it. We do have over here a very simplified diagram of what went on in the mill or what goes on. It is very simplified, but I'll explain a little bit. First of all, yes, as we said, the trucks or the trailers would bring in the grain. They would dump it in a bin on the far side of the building. It would go down to the basement and would be picked up and taken to the third floor of the mill where they separated out the stones or dirt or perhaps small metal pieces that had gotten in the farmer's truck or his wagon or came off of his threshing machine. it goes and is cleaned at a scourer. A small amount of water is added for the milling process. Of course, the farmers wanted to keep their grain dry at home, but to mill it, we add a little bit of moisture, which softens the grain kernels and helps split out the bran, which is the outer portion of the grain. It comes down, goes through the breaking rolls, which are right outside here, and it's where the grain is actually cut. We don't try to squeeze it or smash it. We cut it into small pieces as it begins this process. It goes through the breaking rolls, up through some sifters on the third floor, which the sifters help divide the pieces into larger and smaller particles. There are actually 12 sifters and 12 breaking rolls, so it continually does this, making the cutting the particles into smaller and smaller pieces until we actually turn it into flour. But in the flouring or making the flour process, in this mill, back in those days, they liked white flour. They didn't like whole wheat flour. That was not the in thing 100 years ago.
It was like fancier to have white flour,
right?
Wasn't it?
White flour was cool. The the old gray or brown flour from the grindstones was never as nice or clean or as white. So we wanted to be, I guess, upscale in that way, and that we could have white flour. So we were wanting to eliminate the outer bran coating of or covering of the wheat kernel, and that is done on the second floor where the bran dusters and purifiers, to eliminate everything except the white center part of the grain. It goes up then to the final cleaning and what is called a dresser. It's a very, very fine screen. And once it passes through that, it goes into the holding bins and back down into the packing station. So it's a very simplified diagram. Again, like I said, it goes many times through some of these processes, but eventually we end up with the flour and the bran, which is the outer covering that we don't want. In this case, the bran's used, of course, for dog food or cattle food, or it might even be your raisin bran in the morning. So
little Kellogg's. So you're going to show us all of this actual equipment today.
Yes, we'll be able to look at just about everything here. So
okay,
great.
Let's go. So where are we now, Karmon?
Well, we're on the first floor. These are called the breaking rolls. And these are how the grain is first cut into small pieces. There are two large cylinders that rotate against each other. The gap between these two cylinders is very small. On the first set of the rolls, it's just slightly smaller than a kernel of wheat. As it gets down the line, as these get finer and finer particles, the rolls get closer and closer together until actually the last set they're actually rubbing each other. We're trying to break those wheat kernels down into the smallest pieces we can to make flour. Probably what we would call a foreman or the person running this mill will probably stay in this area quite a bit of the time. He could adjust several things on these mills. He was able to adjust the distance between the actual rolls because, depending upon the variety of wheat or on the particular year when the grains might be fatter or thinner, he wanted to be able to adjust. So each one of these machines made finer and finer adjustments or made it smaller. It's called a gradual reduction process. It's still used in modern mills today. They do the very same things, except the equipment is, of course, quite a bit larger because this mill could process 30 bushels of wheat per hour, which would make about 1,800 No, 1,400 pounds of flour per hour. And today's mills will do probably 20 to 100 times more than that. So this wouldn't be efficient in today's kinds of operations.
But for its day, it was efficient, and it was efficient with the staff, because how many people worked here?
Well, there were typically 4 to 6 people. We have never seen any photos or any records of more than that many, more than 6 at the most being here.
Crazy. And we'll learn more about how much they did.
Yes.
And the time frame they did it in, and it's
right.
it's unbelievable.
And we're sure that there probably were 2 shifts, maybe 3, because when you got this all running, if you're familiar with anyone that does baking or cleaning in your own experiences, you don't want to have to clean this stuff up every night, because the flour would tend to cake up and things. So they would operate 7 days a week, 24 hours a day when they had the product. And so they were able to put out quite a bit of flour.
So what other adjustments did the foreman do from this part of the building?
Well, like I said, he did these adjustments, made everything sure it was working correctly, but he also had a couple of other options. He had a speedometer or a tachometer that would have been attached to the belt up there, which told him how fast this whole machinery was running. It was all powered by the river. The Smoky Hill River is just outside, and he was able to keep the turbines running at the correct speed and the main drive shaft that came in from the river, so he could make sure everything worked. This small little wheel right down here went all the way out to the river. There's a little shaft that runs out there. He could open or close the gates to the turbines, so he could get more water or less water to make sure that all this machinery ran at the proper speed.
And this all runs off of belts.
Right. There's a single shaft comes from the river. It was utilized all the time, except when there was not enough water in the river. Early on, he found out that was a problem in the middle of the summer, especially during the harvest season or after that. So they did install a steam engine here in the 1890s to be able to power the mill up if the river was very low.
Kind of like a backup generator.
Yeah, that was their backup system. So,
okay.
But that's really what goes on this side. You can see all of these braking rolls. There are 6 machines, but each one has 2 braking rolls inside of it. So there are actually 12 different times that the grain may come into here. And we talk a little bit about the sifting. When it goes, after it's gone through here, it goes up to the sifting floors. If the small particles come through the system, there's no need for them to come back to this or the second one. They may jump clear down to the 4th or 5th one. The larger wheat particles then will come back and be broken down into smaller and smaller ones as we go along.
Can we take a peek inside of one of these?
Sure. Here is the first braking roll. And it's a little bit difficult to see in there, but there are 2 large cylinders. They're probably 8 to 10 inches in diameter that have little corrugations.
And it feels just kind of like corrugated cardboard. It's narrower corrugation, but it would be similar to that, of course.
They're steel roller mills, so that is quite a improvement over the old grinding stones. The very first mill here was just a millstone where he was able to mill the wheat, but of course we don't think it was quite as clean or clear as we have today with this system.
And I noticed one other thing in here. This equipment was made in Kansas.
Yes. Much of it was built in Enterprise. There was a large manufacturer there, which no longer exists, but they had quite a factory that built much of this type of milling equipment.
Okay, take it away.
Yeah. Now we're going to go to the other side of the first floor and we will see how this mill transported the material back and forth. Newer mills today use pneumatic equipment to move the grains and the particles back and forth, but at this time, back in 1890s, we used just a gravity system. So this is called a gravity mill, and everything that happens in here falls down to the basement, is picked up by some elevator legs, and we can see some of those. This is a continuous belt. It's about 80 feet long. It runs from the basement up to the third floor.
And it's got little galvanized cups on it, right?
Yes, right.
It's like riveted in or bolted in.
And so in this mill, there are actually 24 of these elevator legs. Each one of them will have a little bit different product, beginning, of course, down here with the very coarse particles, and they will get finer and finer, or perhaps it's some of the what we would call a byproduct. The bran is being separated out in some of the other processes. So each one of these has a little bit different. They move fairly fast. You can see them when they're going by. So this is how everything happens. You'll see it's all in these wooden cylinders or tubes that will go all the way down. And when the material is on the other side is when the material is probably going into a process.
Okay.
On this side of the, we can also see the packing units. There are actually two packers here. In this mill, they did not pack into small bags like we think of today. They could pack 25 or 50 pound bags. They also had a barrel unit that could utilize about a 200 pound barrel, which would have then been sent to either a bakery or perhaps a general store in the older days when he would then make it out into smaller units for the householders. This unit was a semi-automatic system. This belt, of course, would be continuously running. When he would put in a barrel here, he would just kick this kickstand that would engage a clutch right here, and the clutch would auger in the flour into the barrel. When this barrel got full, they had set a counterweight here. When the barrel got full, it would automatically shut the system off, and he would have a barrel full. He also had a scale, he said, that they could either weigh it and add a little bit or take it out to make sure they were about right.
Precise, exactly.
So they did 25 or 50 pound bags here. When they were processing or filling bags, he had the job, the person that was here, to fill a bag about 1 a minute, 50 pounds per minute. And he also had to hand sew them together because this mill never did have an automatic sewing machine. So he hand sewed them together and threw them out for stacking or sending off. So he did that about once a minute, and that's can be a pretty full-time job to do that.
All day long. But he did have air conditioning.
Right,
Do you want to show us that?
Yes. Well, we joke about this was the only station here that had an air conditioner.
Four-bladed air conditioner.
Had a little fan that ran, again, off of this drive belt that ran the whole system.
Okay, so where do we head now?
Well, we'll go upstairs and we'll look at some of the cleaning systems.
Okay, we'll let you lead the way.
The second floor is called the purification floor. And what they wanted to do, of course, was take out the impurities. And in this case, this mill wanted just white flour. So the bran, or the outer part of the wheat kernel, was not desired in their flour. After the wheat is partially cut, we're not into flour yet, but as we have partially cut up wheat kernels, it comes up through this system called a purifier. The grain that is incoming comes right down here. This machine, when operating, is very noisy. If you ever have a chance to come when it's Millfest, it's very noisy and it vibrates very vigorously. So the grain comes down and bounces along a slanted bed under here that's got perforations in it, small holes. And as the grain comes down here, the lighter particles, well, there's a fan directly above here that creates a low pressure or a vacuum. The lighter bran particles, the air is sucked in here, and the lighter bran particles are actually picked up and sucked up through that fan, go through that square box, which you can sort of see
in the
there.
maze of everything.
And over to that unit that's called a sock duster. It's simply a metal frame with cotton socks or cotton tubes around it. Those cotton tubes are, of course, a little bit porous, so when the air and the particles come through there, the air escapes out through the particles, and it traps the air escapes through the cotton, the particles are trapped inside. This whole unit rotates very slowly, about 1/2 revolution a minute. When it gets to the very top, there's a mechanical hammer built into the system that taps those very top tubes and allows those particles to fall out. They're carried through a small auger that drops directly below that and takes them out to either be further processed or to put into the bran bin. But that's the whole purpose of the second floor, is to purify the flour. We want to get rid of everything that's not white flour, and that's how it's done.
Okay. So where are we headed now?
Upstairs next is...
Next floor.
Yes, there's a sifting floor upstairs.
Okay, let's go.
So this mill, or this floor, was actually built and is not attached to the walls of this building, because they realized that if this shakes too much, we would have some serious structural problems in this building. So the third floor isn't attached. It sets on posts from the second floor and is allowed to bounce back and forth about 3/8 of an inch at a fairly high rate. I mean, it really shakes when we're going. So,
and why does this floor shake so badly? You're going to tell us that.
Right, yeah, that's right. Well, so anyway, we got the sifters. This is the sifting floor, and there are 3 large machines, but each one is divided into 4 portions. So there's actually 12 sifting operations going on, because we got 12 cutting operations or grinding operations, not grinding, but cutting operations in the first floor. So you can see that there are 4 inlets. Here again, everything comes from those elevator legs. So there's 4 inlets here, and this is divided into 4 pieces. The grain that comes into here then goes across these screens as this whole thing is vibrating back and forth. These screens have holes in them at various sizes. The very coarsest screen in this particular one is 64 meshes per inch. Then we go to 110, 120, and 130 meshes per inch. So the grain particles, if they're the biggest ones and don't even go through the first screen, will go down to back to those breaking rolls that says, I've got big pieces, I need to cut them in smaller ones. If it goes through some of the second or the third or the fourth ones, it will direct it down to the one of the breaking rolls that is designed to make the finer pieces even finer. So it's divided into these. There are several outlets. Again, depending upon which of these screens it goes through, will tell it where to go back down into the cutting process, and we want to make smaller pieces.
So how do these machines move? Like, how does this work? Can you show us kind of how this moves?
Well, it operates I can't operate it very fast, but of course everything runs from that main drive shaft, and it shakes very, very vigorously so that the grain, as it bounces across here, will fall through those different screens. These are very fine screens. 130 meshes per inch is quite fine. It's almost as what we need to make flour. The ones on the far end, which are from the earlier parts of the process, are much more coarse. So they will have bigger particles. These will have much, much finer particles at this end. In this mill, the general flow of the material is from the far end to this end. So we're getting close to flour when we're down here at this end.
Can we see a screen?
Sure. We can look at a couple of the screens to give you an idea what it looks like. These are some ones that are broken, but it is a very fine screen. This one has 120 meshes. It
feels like fabric
per inch. And it's actually a silk screen. The very coarse ones are stainless steel. Okay. These are made out of...
What are these things?
Well, when I tell the young kids, I said, we've got a bunch of frogs in here. They don't quite understand that. But when this screen is in that sifter, the whole screen is jumping. And these little frogs in here help the material get so it doesn't get stuck on these screens as they go through. So you have a bunch of frogs in here.
The first time I was told that, I was actually looking for frog.
Yeah. We can look at a couple of the final processes over here, as well as some of the beginnings of when the grain first comes in. On the what we see clear in the back is another large sock duster, as well as the separator that's at the far behind the sock duster. The separator,
get closer to it. And
yeah, the separator is when the grain first comes in. This is what is used to take out the things that we don't want. For instance, in the farmer's wagon, he may have had some dirt, or he may have some stray rocks or something like that. So that tries to get all of those out, because we of course don't want those in our flour. This sock duster is not helping remove the bran. This one in the process is actually taking dust out of that same wagon load of grain that the farmer has brought in. So we want to get the dust and the dirt out as well.
And why is it important to keep the dust down in here?
Well, yes, there is. There's always a concern in any kind of a elevator or grain handling system, because the dust can be explosive in certain concentrations. So that was one of the jobs of one of the men, or maybe all of the men, if they saw a lot of flour dust or particle dust around here, that was one of the things they wanted to do, was clean that up to eliminate those possibilities, or reduce them anyway. Here we have the final flour dresser. This is the one that was required to go through. It's 140 meshes per inch. So the flour had to be that fine to be able to go down to the storage bin directly below there. Another option or another thing that I think is interesting is that even in the early days, white flour was really to be desired. The gray or the grayish type of the old flour from the millstones was fine, but white flour was to be desired. So this mill had their own method of making the white flour even whiter. They used a bleaching process. Today that's all done chemically, but in the 1890s and the early 1900s, they had their own system. Down on the first floor, there's a small spark generator. It's made kind of like the old carbon arc lights, if you're familiar with those, but there's actually a sparks between two electrodes. Air is passed through that, and as the air goes through there, some of the oxygen molecules are changed into ozone. Ozone is a bleaching agent, which they used here to bleach their flour. As the final flour, or as the flour was nearing its end of its cleaning processes, it was augured through these galvanized tubes. And they passed some of that air. If you can see, there's some tubes there and some copper tubing, that the air that had been generated downstairs that had the ozone in it was passed through these cylinders, and that helped make bleach flour. So we can say we've got the whitest bleach flour that was available at the time. It was well known. There's records of it being shipped to quite a few places in the U.S., and it's actually, we have some records that shown there were at least some shipments went back to Europe.
Wow.
So here was one other little option that they had. They could make pancake flour. They used the same, of course, basic ingredients, but when the belt was attached here, it could add small amounts of baking powder or soda or anything else that they wanted to make actual pancake flour. So they had pancake flour here as well.
Can you show the measurement system? I always think this is interesting. It has keys that
Yeah.
they cut.
Yeah, and again, we don't, I have not actually done any adjustments to this or played with this, but they could.
But these are the adjustment
Yeah.
keys. They have a little, like a notch cut out
Yeah.
of them so that they have different measurements on them.
Yeah.
Super cool.
This mill could process wheat and rye. The Scandinavians that lived around here liked rye bread or liked rye things, so they could process wheat or rye. We could not process, corn or soybeans or anything else, which weren't as popular in the early years either. So that's a little bit about this. We can go all the way down to the basement. We'll look at some of the main drive systems, and then maybe we'll go out and see some of the equipment from the outside.
Okay, sounds good. Let's go.
Well, now we're in the basement of the mill. We can see some of the main drive system that was here. There's a large shaft that originally ran all the way to the river, and this shaft was the two turbines out at the river provided the power to run this whole mill. It took about 125 horsepower to run this mill, and so that it took two of the turbines that we had to do that. You can see some of these large leather belts that are here. The largest ones go up to those braking rolls upstairs because they are the ones that require most of the power. There's another large belt at the far end of the building that runs the machinery on the second and the third floors. These belts are made of leather. They're typically 2-ply. They're are pretty solid. There's no connecting links. There's no joints in them. So when they have a problem with them, These particular ones especially are built almost around part of the framework of the building, so they have to be repaired in place. They cannot be, you can't go to the local hardware store and buy one like this. If they do have to work on them or replace them, they simply split the two plies. There are two plies of leather here. They cut them offset so that the two splices aren't together, and glue them back together and put it back into operation. But it has to be done right here because there's no way to take them off and replace them any other way.
So how long do these last?
Well, we have been told, and of course there's none of us really know, but some of them are supposed to be original from the 1890s.
Wow, and they still run. I mean,
they still run. Normally we run every the weekend on the first weekend in May, which is our Millfest weekend, but we aren't able to do that with this health situation. But it's very interesting when this whole operation runs. It's very noisy. There are some areas you cannot hear each other at all. And that even makes it more interesting that 100 years ago, if there was an issue or something needed to be done, you needed to go physically find the person on a different floor and to be able to do whatever needed to be done, because there was no of course, radios, no telephones. In fact, there were no lights in here the first 20 years. So it was...
When did electricity come?
Well, electricity came to Lindsborg in 1904, and we know that there was an auxiliary power motor added in 1908. So it was a while at least. I'm sure they had some kind of lamps or explosion proof, especially because they didn't want those dust particles to be out there that could be ignited. So yes, it was probably darker, and we know it was noisy. So it would have been an interesting place to actually see, operate. But you get a close idea of that if you get a chance to come on Millfest,
which is a one-of-a-kind experience.
It is real.
Will you take us outside and show us where the dam used to be?
Sure.
And explain some of that to us
All right,
now?
we'll look at that out there.
Okay.
Well, now we're on the outside. We're right here with a couple of the large turbines that used to operate the mill. You can see that there are two of these large of them. One of them is a 50 horsepower and one is a 75 horsepower turbine that was utilized. They actually set in the river in a vertical mode like this. There was large gates on here, and we talked earlier about that the miller could open or close these gates to allow more or less water. Most of these are rusted now and you can't operate them, but they were attached to a gearing system. Here's one that is laying down, this particular one. Since they were several feet under the water, of course wanted to get through. When it came through here, these cups created the force when the water shot out here and made this rotate. So we actually had these things spinning at probably about 100 revolutions per minute, and then it was transferred up to the top through a bevel gear system that was enabled. That if you think of your own little mixer at home or an egg beater, sometimes it has a little set of bevel gears. These also had another purpose, or the purpose of that bevel gear was to provide a little bit of a safety device. When you think of a large piece of metal and all of the equipment in there running, it's quite a bit of inertia. I mean, it's a big machine operating. In case something happened or you had an emergency that made it require to stop or jammed it up immediately, you don't want these big steel pieces to be breaking. So they had a real neat way of helping that out, or solving part of that problem. In the bevel gears, that changed the direction from vertical to horizontal to run the drive shaft, they had, some of the gears had wooden teeth. Now you may be able to see that, it's kind of over in the corner, but if something did happen and something jammed up or stopped, immediately it would just break off a couple of those wooden teeth. The system then could be repaired or fixed. They would put in a couple more of, it's about a 1x8 board, put in those, replace the teeth, and that would prevent major damage in some of these larger steel parts, which might take a major renovation to get them repaired. But that was pretty simple. It was just kind of a safety device. They would just break those teeth off and you fix it and you're ready to go again.
Ready to go again. So where are we headed now?
Well, we'll head to the last little stop out there is where the mill or where the turbines in the river actually sat. Of course, they're gone now, but we can look at where they were.
Okay.
Okay, well, as we come around this side, now we're just outside of where the office we saw earlier. And here's the large scale where the trucks or the trailers that the farmers would bring in, they would simply drive up here. They could see the inside, or the operator inside could say, yeah, I've got your Wade, go over to the other side of the building and dump, then drive back here and we'll determine the difference or how much grain you actually had in your wagon. Then we'll go a little bit further down here and we'll look at where the actual turbines were and the dam that was here in the river.
Okay, go ahead.
There were several dams along in this river throughout the years. The very first one in 1872, which is before this mill was built, was a dam made out of cottonwood logs and straw bales.
Wow.
It sat out here and very first had a sawmill and a grist mill. It was there for a couple of years until we had a fairly major flood. And of course there was no dams in the rivers at that point, so everything got washed out. It was rebuilt. The dam was rebuilt as a wooden dam and lasted again several years until another major flood took it out. The last dam that was built, I believe, was in the early 1920s. And it was a concrete dam made that was down there. You can see the little bit of the remains of it on the far side of the river. It lasted until 1940. That dam washed out then, and at that point, the miller said it was going to be too expensive to rebuild that dam. So the last 15 years of operation, they simply ran with an electric motor, which was their backup system after their steam engine failed in early years. Over here, we can see where the turbines actually were. We can't see them, of course they're gone. But the other thing that has happened, since there is no more dam here to keep the water 10 to 15 feet higher on the right side, the water does not pass through this area. And as we have a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, we have some floods, the water comes up and fills this area full of sediment and dirt. So this is not what it looked like at that point. Used to be the water came in here, went through the turbines as the water dropped through that area, and then went out the excess. So the turbines were actually below here's that main drive shaft. We can see just the end of that that operated and ran all the way into the buildings. So it's where it was. It does not exist anymore. This little building that we see between here and the actual mill is where they had that steam engine and later on an electric motor that operated the mill. And when we have Mill Fest today or these years, we just get that electric motor turned on and it operates the whole system.
So before, when you've been here with me, you've shown me how
high the water used to get. And after Canopolis Lake was put in, the reservoir was put in, which was the first reservoir in Kansas that utilized a dam, the flooding stopped here in the same way. But how high would the water get?
We have had records that the water was up to this first floor window up here. So
Crazy.
It was quite a bit higher.
How far are we above the river?
We are probably 20 to 25 feet above the river.
So
But
high water.
even in the 90s and in 2013, when we had the latest, quote, flood, the river was within a foot of this cross piece here. So it was up significantly then, but still
It was like a
probably
100-year
50,
rain or
50,
something,
10 to 15 feet less than what we had then. So.
Well, I thank you for giving us time today. This has been so interesting. And what would be the one thing you'd leave everybody with? Why should they come to the mill?
Well,
what is so great about it?
I think it's a great, it shows, we think we're so new, we're cool, we can do everything, but think of what they did 125 years ago without the equipment, without the
technology,
fancy things that we did. They did a pretty good job. This thing's still standing here. It still operates. We did, of course, in the 70s, spent many years cleaning it up and getting it rebuilt.
And it was a labor of love.
Yep. Yeah, it was just about everyone was a volunteer in town that came out here and put this back together to make it what it is. And it's just a neat thing.
Thank you for sharing with everyone a place that's very near and dear to my heart. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate just your understanding of how everything works here today.
All right. Well, thank you for coming.
So I'm going to sign off today from the old mill. We're glad you could spend time with us. Wasn't it worth the extra amount of watching? Karmon is amazing.